Hi, everybody, and welcome to Mark Overanalyses Film, the podcast where I overanalyze a different film every episode. Today, I'll be looking at 2020's Soul. Soul was written and directed by Pete Docter and Kemp Powers, and they co-wrote the script with Mike Jones. But what most people will recognize straight off the bat is that Soul is made by Pixar. And Pixar are in kind of a strange place right now in 2022, I think. Just about everybody would agree that they're still producing at an unusually high level, but there is a sense that the golden age has kind of passed. When people talk about Pixar, they probably think of Toy Story, Up, The Incredibles, WALL-E, Monsters Inc., or Finding Nemo. But the latest of those films I've just mentioned actually came out 13 years ago. I think since then there's probably been 3 films that would not have seemed totally out of place in that golden era. And they'd be Inside Out, Coco, and Soul. Now, personally, my favorite of these is Soul. But as much as I do love Soul as a film, I still wonder if it's just a little below the absolute top tier of Pixar films. So, today I'd like to take an in-depth look at Soul and figure out if that is the case and why that might be. To do that, first I'll look at the fundamental features of the protagonist, and then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences of the film. At the end, I'll talk about the main things I learned along the way. So, without further ado, let's get into the 5 questions about the protagonist. Question 1. Whose story is it? I think Joe Gardner is the protagonist here because of the fundamental question, whose change defines the film? While you could say that both Joe and 22 change significantly, 22 is a child invigorated to overcome her fear to go on an adventure. For Joe, though, it's a matter of, learning to smell the flowers along the way. And it's hard to deny that this latter point is the message, really, of Soul. So for that reason, Joe Gardner, a middle-aged music teacher in New York who still dreams of becoming a full-time jazz musician, is our protagonist. Question 2. What is his life dream? Life dream here refers to what it is that the protagonist wants before the story really begins. It's rarely clearer than here in Soul. Joe is obsessed with jazz, and his whole life's dream up to this point has been to be a full-time jazz musician. Question 3. What is his want? Want, in this case, refers specifically to what the character is trying to achieve in Act 2 of the film. From the moment they start their new adventure or journey until the point where they seem most defeated. A want in film, therefore, is generally a SMART goal, in that it is specific, measurable, achievable, just about, relevant, and time-bound. Again, Soul makes this really clear. To put it as simply as we can here, let's say that Joe's want is to get back to his body. This is the question that will be asked at the end of Act 1 and answered about 48 minutes later as we move into Act 3. Question 4. What is Joe's need? The protagonist's need in this instance is the human quality or piece of wisdom that the character lacks at the beginning of the story. Okay, so how do you define a character's need in a film that is about the meaning of life? Well, Pixar actually do it in several genius ways here, but I'm going to try and put it into words. Joe loves jazz, but has stopped really listening. So I'm going to say that Joe needs to slow down and listen to his students, to his family, to 22, to the world, and to life. Question 5. Does he get what he wants and or what he needs? During the Little Women pod, I said most bittersweet films will have the protagonist get what they need, but not what they want. And Soul feels kind of bittersweet, I think. But Joe actually does get both what he wants and what he needs. The bittersweetness here actually comes from the lesson he learns, that what he wants, or what he always wanted, is not the thing that would actually bring him real happiness. Okay, now that I've attempted to answer the 5 key questions, let's have a look at Soul's sequences. There is normally, but not always, 8 sequences in a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be roughly between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should, on some level, be asking themselves a different dramatic question. Act 1 contains the first 2 sequences. Sequence 1 is generally some version of Life as It Is. And is anyone better at introducing characters and their lives than Pixar? Here we meet Joe as he teaches a mediocre middle school music class. And within 3 minutes, Joe is going to tell us a lot. Textually, he's telling the story of how he fell in love with jazz. But in doing so, he reveals his life dream, but also the flaw in his thinking. But most of us, I think, probably won't recognize that until much later. Because, it should be noted, his flawed thinking is quite compelling. It's a strong argument that could easily be the moral of the story. But it isn't the moral of this story. And Joe is soon to be offered something else. Something the films rarely show in a good light. A stable, permanent position. Now we know this job offer is a good idea because his mom is in favor of it, and just to confirm this doubly, we have characters around agreeing with her. Now we know that she's basically right, but there is a problem we feel that Joe feels pressured into going along with what she wants. But at that, our inciting incident arrives, the event without which our story as it is would not happen. Joe's former student is drumming for the Dorothea Williams, and he's got Joe a shot at playing with her. Joe is soon with the band, and as he plays, the thing he described in the opening scene happens. He experiences flow. He's in the zone. It's intoxicating, and he's rewarded for it, because he's clearly talented, but you might notice that it's characterized by him losing touch with those around him. Within moments, Joe is dancing down the street, giddy, distracted, detached from life around him. I have to think this scene is inspired by a famous Charlie Chaplin story about how to make a lady slipping on a banana peel funny. He said, you show the lady approaching, then you show the banana peel, then you show the lady and the banana peel together, then she steps over the banana peel and disappears down a manhole. Now, we've seen Joe's life, and now we've seen Joe's death by the looks of things, but we're actually only 9 minutes in. And I'd argue that while the 9 minutes feel busy, they don't feel rushed. But Joe is dead now, or dying at least, so we now have a new question. Will Joe figure out a way to get back to his life? And this is our tension for sequence 2. Joe runs away from the light and falls into the great before, which I love as an invention, even though I think the U Seminar rebranding joke is a bit too of the moment. More pressingly though, Joe does find a potential way back home. He plans to teach someone, inspire them to achieve their spark, then steal their spark-inspired Earth Pass to get back, play the gig of his life, and then, be happy forever. You might notice how this plan is a metaphysical but practical push and pull between the 2 potential paths presented to him in sequence 1. While Joe is now focused on being a musician, when he finally becomes a real mentor at the end of the film, we'll see just how much he's changed from this point. Now, there's a detail that's easy to miss here. I certainly missed it the first time. Spark remains somewhat undefined throughout Soul, leading Joe to misinterpret it as purpose, or the passion that gives life meaning. But the moment that Joe formulates his plan is actually the moment where one of the Jerrys raises the question, and just what is this spark? Again, notice here just how often already we've seen that Joe is not listening to those around him. But for now, he's introduced to his mentee, 22. 22 is diametrically opposed to Joe. While he is desperate to get back to Earth, she's trying to avoid living at all costs. While he's obsessed with jazz and the idea that it will provide his life with meaning, she's the ultimate cynic, always protesting too much, that everything is pointless. What they have in common then is the thing that they're both missing, the little things that make life life. In the end, they'll learn this, having pulled each other towards the other's argument. Just right now though, at exactly 25 minutes in, they come to an agreement. 22 will try to find/fake a reason to live so that Joe can take her opportunity to do so. Joe has found his potential ticket back, so we end Act 1 and move into Act 2. Act 2 begins with Sequence 3, the first attempts to solve the problem. As you may recall, characters here are trying to return to the stasis they had at the beginning of the story. And in this case, in our What's the Plan scene, 22 has made a plan to keep doing what she's doing indefinitely, while Joe is going to get his shot at a gig. The first attempts begin with the Hall of Everything, where 22 is unimpressed by everything. But this is, interestingly, in contrast to the home that 22 has made for herself. For all of her attacks on Earth, her home is strangely full of earthly knickknacks, and perhaps most noteworthy, there's a collection of name tags of her previous mentors. Of course, one could interpret this as some kind of display of spite, but really the biggest difference between her and Joe is that 22 is a people person. Joe would never have even thought to keep name tags. And then we're introduced to the zone and the concept of lost souls. And notice how dangerous they are. We're told here that obsessions hurt not only the obsessed, but those around them. Moonwind soon confirms that lost souls are not that different from people in the zone, which is a clear warning to Joe. But for now, as we come to the end of the third sequence, we have the character's first unconscious move towards their need. In order to reconnect with his body, Joe is forced to slow down and really pay attention to his surroundings.
See if you can smell and feel where your body is. I hear a heart monitor. I can smell hand sanitizer.
Yes. Yes. Good.
I think I can feel my feet. I feel fur.
But he's being made to do this, and as soon as he thinks that he's far enough along, he ditches the process and jumps for it. He returns to Earth, unwittingly bringing 22 with him. And so we end Sequence 3 and move in to Sequence 4. This sequence, Sequence 4, is characterized by greater attempts to solve the problem. The protagonist now realizes that getting back their stasis will be a lot harder than they thought. And in this case, Joe is now a cat, and 22 is in his body. So yeah, one could say the problems are considerable. But after some initial panic, they do come up with a plan, and so we wonder, can they succeed in finding Moonwind? Here, Joe is compelled to work with 22 to get her to try the fundamentals of life. And it's a great example of what John York calls experimenting with knowledge in his fantastic book Into the Woods. This experimenting is exemplified in Joe realizing that 22 is hungry and getting her a slice of pizza, and 22 realizing, correctly, that pepperoni pizza alone would make life worth living. A quick note here, I've seen this moment of getting pizza posited as the midpoint or the first conscious move towards the character's need, and I can very much see why, but I don't agree. While it is the first moment that Joe helps 22 and that 22 begins to enjoy things about Earth, neither character is really changed yet. They're not really different in the next scene. That change is coming, but it's going to come in a few minutes. I think the confusion, though, does suggest a potential issue with Joe's agency and with the structure of Act 2 overall, which I will discuss further later. Anyways, the pair find Moonwind, and he actually can fix this, which seems rather neat, but whatever, it's a 90-minute film, and that's not the point. So, we have a new objective. Get to the club for 6:30 so that Moonwind can perform his astral transmigration displacement, of course. Now, we're lacking a little dramatic impetus at this point, you might notice. So the story has Joe and 22 happen to run into Dorothy Williams while he looks, insane. Joe had to get cleaned up anyways, but now he's really going to have to look sharp. With tensions raised, they rush home now, where we then have the all-important midpoint. The midpoint is the character's first conscious move towards their need, and this is an interesting one, because as far as I can tell, the breakthrough here is 22's, but she experiences it in Joe's body, which means that he will be the beneficiary of it later on. In this moment, though, Joe is still going on dismissing everything that isn't helping him get what he wants. 22, though, overcomes her initial fear to be drawn to Connie. They firstly bond over their shared purported cynicism, but things really change when Connie reveals the earnestness beneath. The fact that she, as a child, is really just desperate for a mentor to tell her to keep doing what makes her happy. 22 is confused but intrigued by seeing this defense mechanism, which so mirrors her own, as a clear facade. And it's a real breakthrough for her. It's worth noting as well that in this moment with Connie, she acts as the mentor that she herself never got. She encourages Connie, and you'll notice in doing so, she doesn't say, "Wow, you're great." She says, "Wow, you really love this." As we'll see, 22 significantly changes from this point on. And the fact that she has really changed now leads us into sequence 5, the honeymoon sequence. The honeymoon sequence then is when the protagonist starts to act in accordance with their need, and things generally start to go a little bit better. Suddenly we have fun, up-tempo music as Joe and 22 now work together in greater harmony than before to get Joe in shape for the gig. However, they're still struggling with this, so Joe decides to try and cut his own hair as a cat, which is not a great idea. So soon they're making a dash to the barber shop. And here, Joe is again confronted with what he's been getting wrong with life. He thought Connie wouldn't understand George Orwell, but 12-year-olds understand tyranny. And he thinks Des the barber was born to cut hair because he never talked to Des about Des. Not only does 22 do this, but she also no longer associates with the cynic in the room. She's also a great communicator because she's genuinely interested.
I don't know about this crazy cat guy thing, man, but it is nice to finally talk to you about something other than jazz, yo.
Huh. How come we, never talked about your life before?
You never asked, but I'm glad you did this time.
Looking good, brother.
Great show. I grabbed a couple road lollies.
But while all this is going on, Terry the accountant is closing in, and so we sense the honeymoon sequence is about to end as we enter sequence 6. Sequence 6 is the bridge from the honeymoon period to the low point, so it's where all the problems really start coming home to roost. And you'll notice here that as 22 and Joe walk down the street, Joe cannot accept the argument being presented now by 22. She says to deal with Paul the cynic, she just let out the me, which is what Joe said jazz was for. But Joe dismisses this idea. Music and life are not the same, he insists. So he's kind of saying here, music is for self-expression, life is not. And just as Joe begins to give a little, smiling at 22's joy, her goofing causes Joe's plans to split. And just like that, Joe's brief, ever so slight succumbing to the idea that maybe life is to be enjoyed is rudely interrupted by his objective. The rush is back on, he'll have to get his suit fixed, which means help from Mom. Now with the pressure on again, Joe starts being mean to 22. When she's taken by music on the subway, Joe dismisses her as a factor. She loves music only because she's in his body, he insists. We're about to get to a big scene with his mom, but it is worth pointing out the subway scene here, which will be mirrored later on. It's a great place to point out just how hard the drudgery of everyday life can be. And it's also where the film highlights that Joe somehow thinks that this gig will save him from this kind of thing somehow. Joe is of course dreaming here, and his dreams are about to run right into his pragmatic mother. Unsurprisingly, his mother lectures him, and Joe, as Kat, sighs and complains that she never understood him really. To his horror, 22 repeats this, not knowing any better. This results in Joe finally fronting up to his mother about how he feels, and the ensuing argument is finished when Joe reveals, "I'm just afraid that if I died today, that my life would have amounted to nothing." His mom is moved, and after all, she just wants to help her son, so she offers him the support he needs right now. He's surprised and ultimately moved to see this reaction from his mother. But you may notice he's not learning the lesson. As they finally get to the half note, 22 has a wonderfully depicted moment of transcendental peace as a propeller seed falls into her hand. But Joe remains oblivious. He asks her if she's ready to go home and get back off this stinky rock. I think this is actually the first time he's checked in with 22. And in the previous scene, he opened up and told his mother how he felt, and she encouraged and supported him. In the very next scene, 22 tries to tell him how she feels, and he dismisses it. He does the opposite of what a teacher should do. He takes all the credit for the things that she has accomplished. When he pushes to get her to start the procedure without really hearing her, she panics and makes a run for it. At the same moment, Terry locates them again and strikes. They're suddenly dragged back into the Great Before, where all discover that 22 has somehow gotten her Earth Pass. Now, even more than in the last scene, Joe insists that her accomplishment really belongs to him. And the real problem, of course, is that 22 believes him. So much so that she gives up her chance to live now and gives her Earth Pass to him. Which is exactly what Joe planned in sequence 2. Now, it should be mentioned that Joe's first instinct is to throw it back, but he is now so deep into his own argument that he doesn't even believe Jerry when they tell him that a spark is not a purpose. As 22 disappears into the zone chastising herself for having no purpose, Joe proceeds with his plan. But even as he jumps towards Earth, we can see that really, deep down, he doesn't believe in it anymore.
You mentors and your passions, your purposes, your meanings of life. So basic.
No, it is music. My spark is music. I know it is.
I'm no good. I got no purpose.
And so we enter Act 3. Act 3 begins with sequence 7, the false resolution. And this one is the real reason I wanted to cover Soul, because I think this sequence is amazing. Joe returns to his body, snaps to, and runs to his gig. But the Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor score works great here to tell us that things, aren't really what they need to be. He gets to the gig and nails it. And it's great that the film can show this while maintaining its overall tone. Even Joe's mom is there in the crowd cheering. This would be the true resolution in any number of films. But then, this film, like life, keeps going. Outside, everyone goes home. And Joe can't help but feel empty. He finds himself and his life feeling much like before. Dorothea tells him a great metaphorical story about a fish that swims through water, not recognizing that it's in the ocean. Joe finds himself back on the subway. The gig hasn't really changed anything. And what follows then is one of those scenes that will stay with me for my entire life. Joe comes home and sags at his piano. He empties his pockets of all the crap that 22 has picked up during the day and thoughtlessly strikes a couple of keys. But then his eyes fall on what 22 collected, and he really sees it now. It's worth noting that if an adult took these things out of their pocket, we'd call an ambulance. But if a child took them out, we'd see the fascination with the everyday. And this triggers a flashback to the moment of transcendence that 22 was having at the end of Act 2. Then another to her first ever slice of pizza. Joe then takes away the sheet music and spreads the miscellany out before him. This is what Pixar are just special at. This is Joe's need expressed through action. At this moment, he stops following the plan, the sheet music, and he searches within himself for something deeper. As he plays, he experiences a transcendental moment wherein he recalls 22's memories. Brief structure note here. We move from 22's memories to Joe's own deeper memories, but the last 22 memory, or the bridge, is the midpoint that we had of seeing Connie truly enjoy music. I'd say that Joe is having one of those rare moments where we feel completely in sync with life. This scene so far, you might notice, has had no dialogue. This is done with a combination of visuals, sound design, and Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor's amazing Epiphany song. It is pure cinema. Kubrick said that 2001: A Space Odyssey was designed to be a non-verbal experience that would defy intellectual articulation. And you can't really describe this scene. You have to see it, you have to feel it. It's what can be special about film. But then we do hear voices, and it's jolting to us as it is to Joe.
Maybe skywatching can be my spark. Or walking. I'm really good at walking.
Those really aren't purposes, 22. That's just regular old living.
He stops playing, picks up the helicopter seed, and realizes that he's left 22 behind. He doesn't say this, but we know it because Pixar really know how to represent ideas through movement, gestures, expressions. Joe puts the propeller seed back down, focuses, and starts playing. And at that, we move from the real world back into the astral plane, and from sequence 7 into sequence 8, the true resolution. We're 9 minutes from the end of the film now, and we have some version of the main question, will Joe make peace with 22? Joe arrives in the zone and is immediately greeted by Moonwind, who reveals that 22 has become a lost soul. Joe chases her down, and in an attempt to defend herself, she swallows him. And here we see 22's inner sanctum, which is a nice role reversal of what 22 got to do with Joe in Act 2. And now we see the harm that mentors can do. 22 is fundamentally a child, and if you tell a child they're not good enough, they'll probably believe you. Joe eventually makes his way past all of her mentors, including him telling her that she has no purpose, and places the propeller seed in her hand. At that, we're back at the stoop where she watched the seed fall. And Joe now has learned to take his role as just one part of the universe as a mentor. So now, rather than scold or be self-concerned, he tells her that she's great at jazzing, which, according to the film's definition, means she's great at being herself. At that, her soul becomes unlost. Joe returns her Earth pass, and when she realizes that this means he won't get another chance to live, he cuts her off by saying, "I already did, now it's your turn." He offers to accompany her as far as he can, which again is a lovely representation of being a parent or an older mentor. They jump and hurtle towards Earth. When 22's Earth pass pulls her away, Joe nods and it's all right and lets her go. Joe reappears on the edge of the great beyond, as he was 10 minutes into the film, only this time he's at peace. But, having acted in accordance with his need now, he's rewarded. Jerry appears and offers him another chance for his inspirational endeavors. In a lesser film, I think this would probably be terrible, but in Soul, it's earned, fitting, and genuinely moving.
So, what do you think you'll do? How are you going to spend your life?
I'm not sure. But I do know. I'm gonna live every minute of it.
There are two things I'd like to touch on in Soul, and the first is that question of what might be holding Soul back from being a truly classic Pixar film. Now, of course, what makes a film truly great is extremely subjective and hard to define, but I'm going to focus here on what I perceive to be issues with Act 2. Act 2s are tricky. It is the longest of the 3 acts, and it charts the journey of change in the protagonist. For that to happen, 2 things have to be present. Number 1, the protagonist has to drive the action. A passive protagonist is always a problem because if a protagonist isn't making choices, it's very hard to define them or for an audience to discern their true character and how that might be changing. Number 2, the character does have to change. They have to be different at the end of Act 2 than at the beginning of Act 2. Also, I'd like to note that the events of Act 2 need to be precisely calibrated to the need of the protagonist. The choices the protagonist makes should ideally relate directly and precisely to their need, to the moral of the story. So, once Joe is in the body of a cat, he becomes quite passive. The one action that he really takes is to go get the pizza for 22, which is why I believe this could be mistaken for the midpoint. During the real midpoint, as I understand it, as 22 encounters her need, Joe is behind the door grouching. In the barbershop, he's forced to sit and listen, which is his need, but he's passive. He's not choosing to do this. He's kind of being made to against his will. Now, he does confront his mother, but this is where the lack of precision is an issue. Confronting his mother is not exactly an expression of either his flaw or his need. Not precisely enough. And you can see how this passivity and lack of precision is expressed through the second act's somewhat reliance on cutting to Joe's cat's surprised face. He looks like he's realizing something, especially in sequences 5 and 6, but he's not acting on it. In the scene that follows his mother listening to him and helping him out, he does nothing of the sort with 22. Joe acts just like he would have at the beginning of Act 2. He hasn't changed at all, really. This all makes Act 2 feel a little bit shapeless. Now let me compare this to Finding Nemo's second act. Marlin is a nervous control freak, but he has to find Nemo. He runs into Dory, ventures out into the ocean, and immediately encounters well-meaning but exceptionally dangerous sharks. Then he's pushed by Dory into diving into the inky depths to find a diving mask. But then there's a little retrenchment, right? He chooses not to listen to Dory and to go over the trench because it appears to be the safe option, but it isn't. And then we have the midpoint as, surrounded by jellyfish and needing to save Dory, Marlin finds the safest way to do a very dangerous thing. And he discovers that he's actually having some fun. After the honeymoon period, he allows Dory to approach a mysterious shadow for directions. When that turns out to be a whale that swallows them, Marlin, who's been obsessed with the safety of control, listens to Dory now and lets go. The decisions and the development towards Marlin's need have truly exceptional clarity and precision here. I will say in Soul's defense though, it does do something really interesting. While Joe essentially seems the exact same after all the events of Act 2, in Act 3, he suddenly receives the wisdom of the journey through 22's memories. When I think of character change, I often think of Hemingway's famous quote about bankruptcy. It happens gradually, then suddenly. But Joe's change is actually kind of like ketchup in a bottle. It's stuck, and then it all comes flooding out. When it does, it's majestic. But I think it does lead to story shape issues in Act 2, which in turn possibly stops Soul, despite its great features, from being in the absolute top tier of Pixar films. There's one other thing I want to touch on here. One of the tenets of auteurism is that an auteur will often return to the same ideas and arguments over and over again, trying to make sense of them. And Pete Docter is, in this regard, something of an auteur. Monsters, Inc., Up, Inside Out, and Soul are all deeply concerned with the idea of someone looking after or failing to look after someone else. They're all deeply emotional as well, but what I'm most interested in is the question of why Pete Docter feels the need to keep telling himself to appreciate the little things. Regardless, I'm glad that he does, because nobody celebrates the quotidian like him. While everyone probably remembers Up for its emotional roller coaster beginning, I was always struck by Russell's sad line later. Recalling a memory of his dad, he says, "That might sound boring, but I think the boring stuff is the stuff I remember the most." I love that line because I think it's true, but films are generally not very kind to the boring stuff. How many American films have anything good or interesting happen in a supermarket? The Hurt Locker makes buying cereal look Sisyphean. I go to the supermarket all the time, it's really not that bad. And Soul plays with this idea too. In The Hall of You, Joe looks at his life in stiller moments and concludes that his life was meaningless. The last thing he looks at directly before making this assertion is a memory of him sitting in a booth eating a piece of cake. 55 minutes later, during his epiphany, he recalls eating perhaps that same piece of cake. But this time, he recalls the texture of the cake as he slices into it. He remembers savoring the delicious taste. There are so many modern films that, are supposed to be about life that end up having a badly tacked on ending or relying on way over the top characters and moments to make its point or give it definition. And this robs these films of any truth that they're trying to get at. It's probably unfair to pick on any films here, but I'm going to do it anyways. Films like This Is Where I Leave You or The Way, Way Back immediately spring to mind when I think of this stuff for some reason. I mean, I associate with Unborn Soul 22 much more than any character in those films. Pixar and Pete Docter in particular, though, might play with time and space and perception through animation, but their characters' experience of and their relationship to the everyday is truer than just about any other Hollywood filmmakers working today, I think. And so with Pete Docter's films, I remember an old man and a child sitting eating ice cream. I remember the look on a grown-up's face as he sees a child he thought he'd never see again. I remember a woman taking the time to sit with an upset companion, and a man sitting at a piano appreciating the little things. And so, with Pete Docter's films, it's the boring stuff I remember the most. This has been Mark Overanalyses film on Soul. In the next episode, I'll be looking at little-known cult curio The Godfather. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, follow, recommend, and whatever else it is that's good for this kind of thing. A special thanks to Mary Kate O'Flanagan, who taught me just about everything I know about film, including these methods. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.